Charter Twin. The Emperor's Vision. Close your eyes for a moment and let me take you somewhere extraordinary. Picture yourself standing on the banks of the Yangtze River in the year 1403. The air is thick with sawdust and ambition. The rhythmic hammering of 10,000 craftsmen echoes across the water. And before you rises something the world has never seen. You've just put down your phone, haven't you? One last email, one final check of tomorrow's calendar. The weight you carry feels familiar tonight. That particular heaviness that comes from building something larger than yourself, from holding a vision that others can't quite see yet. What you're experiencing in this moment, this restless energy between exhaustion and possibility, it's the same force that once moved emperors to reshape the very boundaries of the known world. Tonight, I want to tell you about a dream that consumed an empire, about ships so vast they defied belief, and a vision so audacious it would either elevate China to unprecedented heights or drain its treasury dry. This is the story of the treasure fleet, and it begins with a man who understood something profound about the weight of leadership. The Yongle Emperor stood at the edge of his world in more ways than one. Born Zhu Di, he had seized the throne through civil war, wresting power from his nephew in a conflict that left scars across the realm. Now, in the early years of the 15th century, he faced the eternal challenge that confronts every leader who has fought their way to the summit. What do you build when you've won everything there is to win? The answer came to him not as a whisper, but as a roar that would echo across oceans. Picture the imperial court in those early days of his reign. The Forbidden City was still taking shape, its vermilion walls rising like a promise of permanence. But Yongle's gaze wasn't fixed on Beijing's growing skyline. It was drawn inexorably toward the horizon. Beyond the South China Sea lay kingdoms he had only heard described in the accounts of merchants and diplomats. Ceylon, with its precious gems, the Spice Islands with their aromatic treasures, the mysterious ports of India and Arabia, and perhaps even the fabled coast of Africa itself. Other emperors might have been content to wait for the world to come to them, but Yongle possessed that particular restlessness you might recognize, the inability to accept limitations that others took for granted. He would not simply trade with these distant realms. He would not merely send ambassadors bearing gifts. No. China would arrive at their shores with such overwhelming magnificence that the very concept of Chinese power would be redefined forever. This is where our story truly begins, in the shipyards of Nanjing, where the impossible was about to take shape. The man Yongle chose to transform his vision into reality was named Ma He, though history would remember him by a different name entirely. Born into a Muslim family in Yunnan province, he had been captured as a boy, castrated, and brought into imperial service. Such was the brutal machinery of empire in those days. Yet, from this personal tragedy would emerge one of history's most extraordinary figures. He possessed something that caught the emperor's attention immediately. While other courtiers spoke in careful platitudes, this young man spoke of distant lands with the precision of someone who had studied every map, memorized every trader's tale, absorbed every fragment of knowledge about the world beyond China's borders. When Yongle described his vision of a great fleet, Ma He didn't flinch at the audacity of it. Instead, he began calculating how many ships, what provisions, which routes, what diplomatic protocols. The emperor renamed him Zheng He, and with that new name came a responsibility that would have crushed a lesser man. He was to build and command a fleet unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not merely large ships, but floating cities. Not just a trading expedition, but a projection of imperial power so overwhelming that distant kings would have no choice but to acknowledge China's supremacy. Standing in those bustling shipyards, watching the first massive timbers being shaped, Zheng He must have felt the particular weight that comes with translating someone else's impossible dream into practical reality. You know this feeling, don't you? When the vision is crystal clear, but the path forward is shrouded in 1,000 uncertainties. The scale of what they were attempting becomes clear when you understand the ships themselves. The largest vessels in Zheng He's fleet, the treasure ships that would give the expedition its name, were said to be over 400 feet in length. To put this in perspective, Christopher Columbus's flagship, still decades in the future, would measure less than 90 feet from bow to stern. These weren't just ships. They were statements written in wood and sail and bronze. Each treasure ship rose from the water like a floating palace, with multiple decks, private quarters for diplomats and translators, storage holds vast enough to contain entire kingdoms' worth of gifts and trade goods. The largest could carry nearly 1,000 souls. Sailors and soldiers, craftsmen and scholars, diplomats and interpreters, each playing their part in this grand theater of imperial ambition. But the treasure ships were only the beginning. Surrounding them would sail an entire ecosystem of vessels. Troop transports bristling with marines, supply ships loaded with provisions for journeys that might last years, smaller patrol boats for coastal reconnaissance, and specialized vessels for freshwater storage. When fully assembled, Zheng He's fleet would number nearly 300 ships carrying almost 30,000 people. Imagine the complexity of coordinating such an endeavor. Every nail had to be forged, every sail woven, every rope twisted from hemp. Provisions for 30,000 people. Not just rice and dried fish, but medicines, tools, weapons, gifts for foreign dignitaries, spare parts for repairs in distant ports where no Chinese craftsman had ever set foot. The shipyards of Nanjing became a world unto themselves, a hive of activity that operated from dawn until well past sunset. Master carpenters who had spent their lives building river barges suddenly found themselves crafting vessels designed to weather the storms of the open ocean. Metalworkers forged anchors so massive it took dozens of men to move them. Textile workers produced sails that could have sheltered entire villages. Yet, for all the frenetic activity, the technical challenges, the logistical nightmares, what truly drove this enterprise forward was something more fundamental. It was vision, the kind of audacious, transformative vision that refuses to accept the world as it is and demands to reshape it into something unprecedented. Yonglo understood something that modern leaders often forget in our age of quarterly reports and immediate metrics. True power isn't just about what you can control. It's about what you can inspire others to believe is possible. When distant kingdoms saw his treasure ships arriving at their harbors, they wouldn't simply see Chinese vessels. They would see proof that China possessed resources and capabilities beyond their wildest imagination. This was diplomacy through awe, statecraft through spectacle. Before a single word was spoken in any foreign court, the mere sight of the fleet would communicate everything necessary about China's position in the world order. But there was something else driving Yonglo's vision, something more personal and perhaps more relatable to anyone who has ever built something from nothing. Having seized power through conflict, he understood that legitimacy couldn't be won once and then forgotten. It had to be earned continuously, demonstrated repeatedly, proven through achievements so magnificent that they silenced all doubt about his right to rule. The treasure fleet was many things: a diplomatic mission, a trading expedition, a technological marvel, a projection of military power. But at its heart, it was also a leader's answer to that nagging voice that whispers in the darkness. Are you worthy of the position you've claimed? Are you building something that will outlast your own ambitions? As the months passed and the ships took shape, word of the project spread throughout the empire and beyond. Foreign merchants began arriving in Nanjing, hoping to catch a glimpse of these legendary vessels. Scholars debated whether such massive ships could actually survive ocean voyages. Regional governors calculated how many men and how much material their provinces would need to contribute. The skeptics weren't entirely wrong to worry. What Yongle was attempting had never been done before. Not at this scale, not with this level of ambition. The largest previous Chinese naval expeditions had been coastal affairs, keeping land always within sight. Now they were planning to disappear beyond the horizon for months or even years at a time, navigating by stars and currents toward destinations that existed more in imagination than in reliable maps. The financial cost alone was staggering. The treasury that Yongle had inherited was substantial, but this project threatened to consume resources at a rate that made even his most loyal advisors nervous. Every treasure ship required enough timber to build a small town, enough bronze to equip an army, enough silk to clothe a city. Yet still the work continued, driven by something more powerful than fiscal prudence or conventional wisdom. In those shipyards, surrounded by the controlled chaos of creation, Yongle and Zheng He were doing what every true leader must do. They were betting everything on their ability to transform vision into reality. The hammering continued through the night, echoing across the water like a heartbeat of empire. Soon, very soon, these ships would carry China's dreams beyond the edge of the known world. But first, they had to prove they could actually float. Tomorrow, we'll witness the moment when wood and ambition first touched water, when theory met the unforgiving reality of wind and wave. We'll follow Zheng He as he prepared to lead 30,000 souls into the unknown, carrying with him not just the emperor's gifts and China's hopes, but the weight of a vision that would either reshape the world or disappear forever beneath the waves. For now, though, let yourself rest in this moment of pure possibility, when the greatest fleet in human history existed only in the space between dream and reality. Much like what you're building exists right now, in that precious space between vision and achievement. The weight you carry tonight, it's the same weight that once moved mountains and launched 1,000 ships toward the horizon. Crafting the fleet. But let's step closer now, into the heart of creation itself. Picture, if you will, the sprawling shipyards of Longjiang, stretching along the Yangtze River like a city unto themselves. The morning mist rises from the water, carrying with it the scent of fresh timber and the sound of 10,000 hammers working in rhythm. This is where dreams take shape, where the impossible becomes inevitable, one careful stroke at a time. The scale of what you're witnessing would humble even today's industrial giants. 7 massive dry docks, each one large enough to house a cathedral, carved directly into the riverbank. And within each dock, a treasure ship rising like a wooden mountain, its hull alone stretching over 400 feet from bow to stern. To walk the length of these vessels would take you nearly 2 minutes at a steady pace. But it's not the size alone that should capture your imagination tonight. It's the devotion. Watch the master shipwrights as they select each timber with the reverence of sculptors choosing marble. These men have spent decades learning their craft, understanding that a ship is more than wood and iron. It's a living thing that must flex with the waves, breathe with the wind, and carry precious cargo across vast distances without breaking faith with those who trust their lives to its strength. The wood itself tells a story of preparation, that began years before the first keel was laid. Massive teak logs from the forests of Burma, seasoned for 3 full years until they achieved the perfect balance of strength and flexibility. Cedar from the mountains of Sichuan, chosen for its resistance to the ship-eating worms that lurk in tropical waters. And iron. Tons upon tons of iron, smelted in furnaces that burn day and night, shaped by master metalworkers whose families have served the Imperial Navy for generations. There's something profoundly calming about watching true craftsmanship unfold. The way skilled hands know exactly where to place each piece, how much pressure to apply, when to pause and assess before continuing. These shipbuilders work with the patience of gardeners tending ancient trees, understanding that excellence cannot be rushed, only cultivated. In the joinery workshops, master carpenters employ techniques that seem almost mystical in their precision. Watch as they create joints so tight, so perfectly fitted, that they require no nails, only the natural expansion and contraction of the wood itself to hold fast against the tremendous forces the ocean will soon unleash. Each beam is shaped to complement its neighbors, creating a hull that moves as one organism rather than a collection of separate parts. The treasure ships employ a revolutionary design. Multiple watertight compartments, like the chambers of a bamboo stalk. Should the hull be breached in one section, the rest remains secure. It's an innovation born from centuries of Chinese maritime wisdom. The understanding that the sea demands respect, not conquest, and that survival comes through adaptation rather than brute force. But perhaps most remarkable of all is the collaboration required to bring such vessels to life. Imagine coordinating the work of thousands of specialists, the rope makers who spin hemp into cables strong enough to hold masts that tower 15 stories above the deck, the sail makers who weave bamboo matting into sails so vast they could blanket entire villages, the metal workers who forge anchors weighing as much as elephants. Each group must complete their work in perfect sequence. The hull before the decking, the masts before the rigging, the compartments before the provisions. One delay, one miscalculation, and the entire schedule crumbles like sand. Yet somehow, through careful planning and unwavering commitment, it all comes together. There's wisdom here for your own endeavors. The recognition that building something extraordinary requires not just vision, but the patience to let that vision unfold in its proper time. The shipwrights of Longjiang understood that rushing the seasoning of timber would create vessels that cracked under pressure, that skipping steps in the joinery would result in hulls that leaked when they encountered their first serious storm. As evening falls over the shipyards, lanterns are lit throughout the docks, and the work continues. The treasure ships cannot wait for convenient schedules. The monsoon seasons that will carry them safely across the Indian Ocean operate on nature's timeline, not human preferences. So the craftsmen work in shifts, some shaping timbers by lamplight while others sleep, maintaining the steady rhythm of progress that will eventually launch these floating cities toward the horizon. Listen to the sounds of this nocturnal symphony. The steady thok of adzes shaping planks, the creak of pulleys lifting massive beams into position, the quiet conversations of workers sharing techniques passed down through generations. There's something deeply soothing about productive work, continuing while the world sleeps. The knowledge that skilled hands are building something meaningful in the darkness. The provisions alone represent a logistical marvel that would challenge modern supply chains. Each treasure ship must carry enough food and fresh water to sustain nearly 1,000 souls for months at sea. The ship's carpenters are simultaneously constructing elaborate storage systems, compartments for rice sealed against moisture and vermin, tanks for fresh water lined with specially treated wood that won't taint the precious liquid. Quarters for the livestock that will provide fresh meat and eggs during the long voyage. Every detail receives the same meticulous attention. The Admiral's quarters are fitted with windows made from polished shells, providing light while maintaining the strength needed to withstand ocean storms. The navigation rooms are equipped with specially designed cabinets to protect the precious charts and instruments that will guide the fleet across unmarked waters. Even the crew quarters, housing dozens of sailors in efficient but dignified spaces, are crafted with the same care given to imperial palaces. What strikes you most deeply, perhaps, is the faith embedded in every joint and beam. These craftsmen are building vessels for a journey none of them will take, trusting their work to carry others safely across distances they can barely imagine. It's an act of pure service, creating something whose success they'll never witness firsthand, whose impact they'll never fully know. This is the weight that true builders carry, the responsibility to create something larger than themselves, something that will endure long after their own hands have stilled. The shipwrights of Longjiang understood this burden intimately, knew that their craftsmanship would either enable one of history's greatest adventures or condemn thousands to watery graves. Yet they continued their work with steady devotion, finding peace in the knowledge that they were giving their absolute best to something worthy of their skills. Each perfectly fitted joint, each carefully selected timber, each precisely measured beam represented their commitment to excellence, their understanding that meaningful work demands nothing less than complete dedication. As you rest tonight, let their example settle into your thoughts like sawdust on a workshop floor. The weight you carry in building your own ventures, it's the same weight these master craftsmen knew centuries ago. The responsibility to create something worthy, something that will carry others safely toward their own distant shores. Tomorrow's challenges will come in their proper time. For now, rest in the knowledge that, like those ancient shipbuilders, you're part of something larger than any individual effort. Part of the eternal human drive to build, to explore, to push beyond the comfortable boundaries of what we know toward the infinite possibilities that wait just beyond the horizon. Setting sail. And yet, there comes a moment when even the most careful preparation must give way to action, when the theoretical becomes real, and all those months of planning, all those countless hours of craftsmanship, must finally prove themselves against the vast uncertainty of the open sea. By the autumn of 1405, the great port of Longjiang had transformed into something the world had never seen before. Where once fishing boats and merchant junks had bobbed quietly at anchor, now rose a forest of masts so dense it seemed to stretch beyond the horizon itself. The treasure ships, those floating palaces we've watched take shape in the shipyards, now sat heavy in the water. Their hulls dark with fresh lacquer, their sails furled but ready, like sleeping giants waiting to wake. The loading had begun weeks earlier, a choreographed dance of thousands of workers moving with practiced precision. Imagine the scene. Endless lines of porters carrying silk bales that caught the morning light like captured sunlight. Crates of the finest porcelain, each piece wrapped with the care reserved for precious children. Chests of silver ingots, their weight requiring 4 men to carry what would purchase entire kingdoms in distant lands. But it wasn't merely cargo that filled these ships. It was China itself, distilled into transportable form. Master craftsmen brought their tools, ready to demonstrate the superiority of Chinese workmanship in foreign courts. Scholars carried libraries of classical texts, the accumulated wisdom of millennia carefully preserved on silk scrolls. Physicians packed their medicines, their knowledge of healing arts that might save lives in unknown waters. Admiral Zheng He moved through this controlled chaos with the calm authority that had marked his entire career. You might recognize something familiar in his bearing, that particular stillness that comes to those who've learned to carry enormous responsibility without letting it crush their spirit. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that this moment balanced on the edge between triumph and catastrophe, that all their preparation, all their careful planning, would ultimately mean nothing if they couldn't execute when it mattered most. The crews themselves were a marvel to behold, not just sailors, but entire floating communities. There were navigators who could read the stars like familiar text, men who understood that celestial mathematics meant the difference between reaching spice ports and disappearing forever into the endless blue. Marines trained in the arts of diplomacy as much as warfare, for they would serve as China's ambassadors to kingdoms that existed only as names in ancient texts. Cooks who understood the alchemy of preserving food for months at sea. Carpenters ready to repair storm damage with nothing but what they carried. Translators who spoke the dozen languages they might encounter in the ports of Southeast Asia and beyond. Each man chosen not just for his skills, but for his character, for the ability to represent the Middle Kingdom with dignity, even when exhausted, even when afraid, even when homesick beyond measure. The morning of departure dawned clear and still, one of those perfect autumn days when the air itself seems to hold promise. The harbor, which had buzzed with activity for so long, fell into an expectant quiet. 30,000 souls stood ready to leave everything they knew behind. The signal came not with fanfare, but with the simple raising of a yellow silk banner on Zheng He's flagship. One by one, the great ships began to move, their massive rudders turning with the groaning of timber that had been seasoned for years, specifically for this moment. The treasure ships led, their size so immense they seemed to displace not just water, but the very air around them. Behind them came the support vessels, the warships with their complement of marines, the supply ships heavy with grain and fresh water, the smaller craft that would serve as messengers between the giants of the fleet. As they moved from harbor to open water, they formed a procession unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. From the shore, it must have seemed impossible. These weren't ships, they were floating cities, moving with the stately grace of clouds across the sky. The largest treasure ships rose 7 stories above the waterline, their bulk creating their own weather as they passed. Smaller vessels scattered before them like leaves before a gentle wind. But perhaps the most remarkable thing wasn't the size or the spectacle. It was the quiet confidence with which they moved. There was no desperate rushing, no last-minute panic. These were people who had prepared thoroughly, who understood their purpose, who trusted in their collective abilities to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. As the fleet cleared the harbor and felt the first true swells of the open ocean, something shifted in the air itself. The nervous energy of preparation gave way to the steady rhythm of execution. Sailors who had trained for months in harbor conditions now felt their ships respond to real waves, real wind, real weather. The treasure ships, for all their size, moved through the water with surprising grace. Their designers had understood something profound about the relationship between mass and momentum. How something truly substantial, once set in motion, develops its own unstoppable dignity. They didn't fight the ocean. They moved with it, like enormous sea creatures finally returned to their natural element. Zheng He stood on the deck of his flagship as the Chinese coast began to fade behind them. The weight of command sat differently now, no longer the burden of preparation, but the responsibility of execution. Every decision from this point forward would ripple through the lives of 30,000 people, through the fate of the expedition, through China's relationship with the wider world. Yet there was peace in this moment too. The kind of peace that comes when you've done everything possible to prepare, when you've assembled the right people, given them the right tools, and now must trust in the process you've created together. The wind filled their sails with a sound like distant thunder. Hundreds of sails catching the same breeze, transforming the invisible into forward motion. The fleet began to find its rhythm. The steady, hypnotic pulse of a great enterprise finally underway. As night fell on their first day at sea, lanterns bloomed across the fleet like scattered stars. From a distance, it might have looked like a floating city had broken free from the earth itself, carrying all the warmth and light of human civilization into the vast darkness of the unknown ocean. In the gentle rocking of those ships, in the quiet confidence of their movement through the night waters, there was something deeply reassuring. A reminder that the most ambitious journeys begin not with drama, but with the simple act of setting sail, of committing fully to the path you've chosen, and trusting in the preparation that brought you to this moment of departure. Just as those ancient mariners found their sea legs in those first hours beyond the harbor, you too will find your rhythm with whatever voyage you're beginning. The preparation is complete. The course is set. Now comes the steady, patient work of moving forward, 1 league at a time, toward whatever new horizons await. Across the ocean, the days at sea settle into their own rhythm, a rhythm as old as the first sailor who ever trusted wind and wave to carry them beyond the sight of land. In the pre-dawn darkness, before the sun paints the horizon, the navigators emerge onto the deck of the flagship. They carry with them instruments that represent centuries of accumulated wisdom. The magnetic compass, still a relatively new marvel. Star charts copied and refined through generations of seafaring knowledge. And most importantly, eyes trained to read the language written across the heavens. These men understand something profound about guidance, something that perhaps resonates with you as you lie there, contemplating the decisions that await tomorrow. They know that true navigation isn't about controlling your destination, but about reading the signs correctly, adjusting course when necessary, and maintaining faith in your direction even when the immediate path seems uncertain. Watch as the chief navigator raises his astrolabe toward Polaris, that faithful northern star that has guided countless voyagers home. His movements are deliberate, practiced. There's no urgency here, no frantic calculation, just the quiet confidence that comes from understanding your tools, trusting your preparation, and accepting that some journeys simply require patience. The weight these navigators carry is not unlike the weight you carry. They hold the lives of 30,000 souls in their calculations, just as you hold responsibility for those who depend on what you're building. But notice how they don't let that weight create panic or paralysis. Instead, they transform it into meticulous care, into the kind of attention that turns burden into purpose. As the sun rises, the great ships reveal themselves in their full majesty, spread across miles of ocean like a floating city that has somehow learned to move. From the deck of any single vessel, you can see the others, their red sails catching the morning light, their hulls cutting steady furrows through the endless blue. Life aboard these ships has found its own gentle cadence. In the holds below, merchants tend to their precious cargo, silk and porcelain, tea and spices, each item carefully wrapped and secured against the ocean's motion. These aren't just goods. They're ambassadors of an entire civilization, carried across the waters to lands that exist only in sailors' tales and cartographers' dreams. The crew moves through their daily routines with the kind of efficiency that comes from necessity, but also from something deeper. There's a sense of shared purpose here, a understanding that each person's small contribution serves something larger than themselves. The rope mender working in the shade of the mainmast, the cook preparing rice for hundreds, the lookout scanning the horizon from his perch high above the deck. Each carries a piece of the collective endeavor. This is perhaps what strikes you most about their approach to this monumental undertaking. How they've broken down something impossibly vast into manageable daily tasks. They don't try to sail across the entire ocean in a single day. They simply sail well today. They don't attempt to solve every challenge that might arise. They handle the challenges that are actually before them. Weeks pass in this manner, and gradually, the crew develops what sailors call sea legs, that subtle adjustment of body and mind to the rhythm of the waves. But it's more than physical adaptation. It's a kind of psychological settling, a growing comfort with being suspended between departure and arrival, between the familiar and the unknown. You might recognize this feeling, this space between launching something new and seeing its final form. There's uncertainty here, yes, but also a strange kind of freedom. When you're truly committed to a course, when you've moved beyond the point of easy return, there's a clarity that emerges. The endless second-guessing falls away, replaced by the simpler task of sailing well. The ocean itself becomes a teacher in patience. Some days, the winds are favorable. The ships make excellent progress toward their distant destinations. Other days, the air grows still. The great sails hang slack, and the fleet barely moves at all. The navigators don't rage against these calms. They use them. They repair what needs mending. They study their charts. They prepare for the winds that will surely come. There's wisdom in this approach that speaks to anyone who has ever built something meaningful, who has ever committed to a vision that extends beyond the immediate horizon. Progress isn't always linear. Success isn't always dramatic. Sometimes the most important work happens during the quiet periods, the times when it seems like nothing is happening, but when actually everything is being prepared. And then, after months at sea, after countless sunrises and star-filled nights, the lookouts begin to see signs. Not land yet, but the subtle indicators that land is near. Changes in the color of the water, different patterns in the clouds, birds that speak of distant shores. The first time someone calls land ahead, the effect ripples through the entire fleet. But it's not the wild celebration you might expect. Instead, there's a kind of quiet satisfaction, the deep contentment that comes from seeing preparation and persistence rewarded. They knew this moment would come, not because the journey was easy, but because they had done the work necessary to make arrival possible. As the coastline resolves itself from haze into reality, as harbors and settlements become visible, the crew prepares for the next phase of their mission. But there's no rush, no frantic scramble. They approach these new shores with the same measured confidence they've maintained throughout their voyage. They understand something essential about arrival, about reaching the milestones in any significant endeavor. The destination isn't the end of the work. It's simply the beginning of a new kind of work. Each port they reach becomes a starting point for the next leg of their journey. Each successful landfall, proof that the methods that brought them this far can carry them further still. Perhaps this is what you need to remember as you lie there, mind cycling through tomorrow's challenges and next week's deadlines. The builders of great things, Whether treasure fleets, or companies or movements, they succeed not through dramatic gestures or sudden breakthroughs, but through the accumulated power of steady progress, day after day, league after league, guided by clear principles and sustained by patient faith in the direction they've chosen. The ocean is vast, but it yields to those who respect its scale while refusing to be intimidated by it. Your challenges may seem equally vast, but they too yield to the same combination of careful preparation, steady execution, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're building something worth the weight you carry. The stars that guided Zheng He's navigators still wheel overhead, still offer their ancient guidance to anyone willing to learn their language, and the same patience that carried 30,000 souls across unknown waters can carry you through whatever passage you're navigating now. Lands of Wonder. The first glimpse of foreign shore comes not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual awakening of the senses. The sailors of Zheng He's fleet, after weeks upon the endless blue, begin to notice subtle changes in the very air they breathe. The salt tang carries new fragrances, hints of spices and wood smoke, the green scent of unfamiliar vegetation growing thick along distant coastlines. As the treasure ships draw closer to the ports of Ceylon, of Calicut, of Malacca, the ocean itself tells stories of the lands ahead. Seabirds appear in greater numbers, their cries different from those that followed the fleet from Chinese waters. Fragments of wood drift past, carved in patterns the sailors have never seen, bearing the marks of craftsmen working in traditions older than memory. The harbors, when they finally reveal themselves, are worlds unto themselves. Imagine standing on the deck of one of those great treasure ships as it glides into the port of Calicut, watching a city unfold before you like an illuminated manuscript coming to life. The waterfront stretches in both directions, a maze of wooden piers and stone quays, crowded with vessels from every corner of the known world. Here, Arab dhows with their distinctive triangular sails rest alongside sturdy Indian trading vessels, their holds heavy with pepper and cardamom. There, sleek boats from the Malabar coast bob next to broader craft from distant Hormuz, each bearing the distinctive marks of its home waters. And now, into this ancient symphony of maritime commerce, come the Chinese treasure ships, their red hulls and towering masts adding a new note to the harbor's eternal song. The sounds that greet the Chinese sailors are unlike anything in their experience. The musical cadence of Malayalam spoken by local merchants, the rhythmic chanting of dock workers moving cargo, the creak of unfamiliar rigging, and the splash of oars cutting through water that reflects a different sky. Temple bells ring across the city at intervals that follow their own mysterious logic, mixing with the calls of vendors and the laughter of children playing between the warehouses. But it is the scents that truly announce these new worlds, that speak most directly to sailors who have known only the clean emptiness of ocean air for so many weeks. The warm complexity of cinnamon and cloves drifts from the spice markets, mixing with the smoke of cooking fires that burn wood from trees unknown in China. Incense carries from temples where prayers are offered in languages the visitors cannot understand, yet somehow recognize as expressions of hopes and fears they share. The Chinese sailors, as they finally step onto solid ground, find themselves in marketplaces that pulse with an energy both foreign and familiar. The fundamental rhythms of commerce, of human beings gathering to exchange what they have for what they need, these remain constant across all cultures. Yet here, everything is transformed by local custom and climate into something wonderfully strange. In the spice markets of Calicut, merchants display their wares in ways that turn trade into theater. Great sacks of black pepper stand open like treasure chests, their contents spilling across wooden tables in dark, aromatic cascades. Cardamom pods rest in neat pyramids, each one a small green jewel that releases its perfume at the lightest touch. Cinnamon bark curls in spirals that seem to capture the very essence of distant forests, while star anise arranges itself in patterns that echo the constellations the Chinese navigators know so well. The local merchants, wise in the ways of international trade, approach these new visitors with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. They have dealt with Arab traders for generations, with Persian merchants and Indian princes. But these Chinese ships represent something unprecedented in scale and organization. The treasure fleet's arrival is not merely a commercial event, but a diplomatic moment that will reshape the balance of power across the Indian Ocean. Zheng He himself, moving through these foreign markets with the measured dignity his position requires, becomes a bridge between worlds. His own background, born into a Muslim family in Yunnan, raised in the Chinese imperial court, gives him an intuitive understanding of how different cultures might find common ground. He speaks with local rulers not as a conqueror, but as an emissary carrying the respect of one great civilization for another. The gifts exchanged in these encounters tell their own stories of mutual recognition. The Chinese present silk that seems to capture moonlight in its threads, porcelain so fine it appears translucent, lacquerware that gleams like captured flame. In return, they receive not just spices and precious stones, but objects that speak of entirely different approaches to beauty and craftsmanship. Indian textiles, woven with techniques passed down through centuries, display patterns that seem to move and breathe in the tropical light. Carved ivory from Ceylon tells stories in its intricate details, each figure and flourish representing traditions of art that developed along completely different paths from Chinese aesthetics. Pearls from the waters around Sri Lanka glow with an inner light that seems to hold the warmth of these southern seas. But perhaps the most valuable exchanges are not of goods, but of knowledge and perspective. Chinese scholars traveling with the fleet make careful notes of local customs, of architectural techniques, of methods for preserving food in tropical climates. Local learned men, equally curious, ask detailed questions about Chinese medicine, about methods of governance, about the philosophical principles that guide such a vast empire. These conversations, conducted through interpreters and gestures, through shared meals and patient observation, represent something remarkable in human history. Here are civilizations at their peak, confident enough in their own achievements to approach others with genuine curiosity rather than fear or hostility. The Chinese do not come as conquerors seeking to impose their ways, but as representatives of a culture secure enough to appreciate difference. The impact of these encounters ripples outward in ways that will be felt for generations. Local craftsmen begin incorporating Chinese motifs into their work, while Chinese artisans traveling with the fleet learn techniques that will influence imperial workshops back home. Trade routes that have existed for centuries suddenly carry new possibilities, new combinations of goods and ideas that will enrich every culture they touch. As the treasure ships prepare to continue their journey, loaded now with the products and wisdom of these distant lands, the sailors carry with them something more valuable than any cargo. They have seen that the world is far larger and more various than they imagined, yet also discovered that human nature, in its essential qualities, remains remarkably consistent across all boundaries of language and custom. The weight of this knowledge, this expansion of what they understand to be possible, settles into their minds like ballast in a ship's hold. It provides stability for whatever storms they may yet encounter, whatever challenges await in the ports and passages still ahead. They have learned that unfamiliar does not mean threatening. That difference can be a source of enrichment rather than anxiety. And in learning this, they have gained something that no amount of formal education could provide: the deep confidence that comes from having tested themselves against the unknown and found not danger, but wonder. Envoys and emperors. This confidence, this understanding of the world's breadth and beauty, becomes the foundation for something even more remarkable. For these voyages are not merely journeys of discovery, they are missions of connection. In the courts of distant rulers, in the ceremonial halls of foreign palaces, the true purpose of the treasure fleet reveals itself. Zheng He, the Muslim admiral serving a Chinese emperor, becomes something history had rarely seen before: a bridge between worlds. When he steps onto foreign shores, when he approaches the throne of a Sinhalese king or enters the court of a Malay sultan, he carries with him not the swagger of conquest, but the measured dignity of genuine respect. You understand this balance, don't you? The weight of representing something larger than yourself, of knowing that your words, your bearing, your very presence speaks for everything you've built. In those moments when you must carry your vision into rooms where it has never been heard before, where skeptical eyes measure not just your proposal, but your worthiness to make it. The Chinese approach is revolutionary in its restraint. Where other great powers might arrive with ultimatums, the treasure fleet arrives with gifts. Silk that flows like water between fingers. Porcelain so fine it seems to capture light itself. Intricate metalwork that speaks of patience and precision. These are not tributes demanded, but offerings freely given. Demonstrations of capability that require no words of threat. And the response is something that transforms both giver and receiver. Foreign rulers, initially wary of these massive ships appearing on their horizons, find themselves drawn into conversations that span days. They speak of trade routes and seasonal winds, of the challenges of governing distant provinces, of the delicate art of maintaining peace among diverse peoples. In these exchanges, something profound occurs. The Chinese discover that the problems they face in their vast empire, the questions that keep their administrators awake in distant provinces, are not unique to them. A Javanese prince speaks of balancing competing merchant guilds, and Zheng He nods with recognition. A Ceylon king describes the challenge of maintaining authority across scattered islands, and the Chinese admiral shares insights from governing China's river networks. This is the conversation that happens when builders meet builders, when those who carry real weight recognize it in others. Not the surface pleasantries of formal diplomacy, but the deeper recognition that comes when you've both stared at the same impossible problems, made the same difficult choices, carried similar burdens through similar sleepless nights. The gifts that flow back to China tell their own story. Not just the exotic goods that will dazzle the imperial court, though there are plenty of those. Precious stones that catch light like captured stars, spices that will transform the imperial kitchens, textiles woven with techniques unknown to Chinese artisans. But alongside these treasures, something far more valuable travels back across the ocean. Knowledge. Maps drawn by local navigators who know every reef and current. Agricultural techniques developed over generations in different climates. Methods of governance adapted to different cultures and challenges. The Chinese ships return laden not just with cargo, but with solutions, with perspectives, with proof that the world is vast enough to hold many different approaches to the same fundamental problems. And then there are the envoys themselves, the foreign ambassadors who choose to make the long journey to the Chinese capital. Men who have left behind everything familiar, who trust their futures to these massive ships and unknown seas, because they recognize an opportunity that transcends immediate comfort. Some carry with them gifts that will become legend. A giraffe, tall as a tree, stepping carefully onto Chinese soil for the first time in history. Exotic birds whose calls will echo through imperial gardens, whose brilliant feathers will inspire new artistic traditions. These creatures become symbols, living proof that the world holds wonders beyond imagination, that patient exploration reveals treasures no amount of force could capture. But perhaps the greatest gift these diplomatic missions create is something less tangible, yet more enduring. They establish a new way of thinking about power, about influence, about what it means to be great. The Chinese demonstrate that true strength lies not in the ability to take, but in the capacity to give, to connect, to enrich rather than diminish. In the courts of Southeast Asia, in the trading posts of the Indian Ocean, in the memories of sailors and merchants and diplomats, the treasure fleet leaves behind something that will outlast any monument. They leave behind the radical idea that different peoples can meet as equals, that vast differences in culture and custom need not be barriers, but can be bridges to mutual understanding and benefit. This is what you're building too, isn't it? Not just a business, not just a solution to a problem, but a new way of connecting, of creating value that enriches rather than extracts, of proving that patient vision can achieve what force never could. Echoes of the fleet. But even the grandest voyages must find their way home. And in 1433, after 7 magnificent expeditions spanning nearly 3 decades, the treasure fleets made their final return to Chinese waters. The massive ships, those floating palaces that had carried the Middle Kingdom's presence to the furthest reaches of the known world, were quietly decommissioned. Their hulls, which had weathered monsoons and crossed vast expanses of open ocean, were broken apart, their timbers repurposed for more mundane vessels. The reasons? Well, they're familiar to anyone who's watched priorities shift in the corridors of power. A new emperor ascended the throne, one whose gaze turned inward rather than outward. The northern borders demanded attention. The Mongols were stirring again, and the enormous cost of maintaining such expeditions began to weigh heavily on the imperial treasury. The very audacity that had launched these voyages, that willingness to invest in the unknown, gradually gave way to more immediate, more tangible concerns. It's a pattern you recognize, isn't it? The way transformative visions can be quietly shelved when quarterly pressures mount, when boards grow nervous about ambitious timelines, when the safe path suddenly seems more appealing than the revolutionary one. The weight you carry includes this tension between what's possible and what's practical, between the world you could create and the world that demands your attention today. But here's what those who ordered the fleet's retirement perhaps didn't fully grasp. The impact of those voyages couldn't be undone simply by breaking apart the ships. In ports from Malacca to Hormuz, in the courts of Ceylon and Calicut, the memory of those peaceful giants remained. Local rulers still spoke of the admiral with the gentle manner and the gifts that required nothing in return. Merchants still sought the fine porcelain and silk that had flowed so freely from the treasure ship's holds. And in China itself, in the minds of the sailors who had walked foreign shores, in the records kept by the scribes who had documented each encounter, the world had grown immeasurably larger. The Middle Kingdom was no longer the center of all civilization, but rather one remarkable culture among many. The ocean was no longer an impenetrable barrier, but a highway connecting distant peoples who shared more than they differed. Zheng He himself, that extraordinary navigator who had carried China's peaceful intentions across 30,000 miles of open water, lived to see this transformation. In his final years, he must have stood sometimes at the ports where his great ships had once anchored, watching smaller vessels come and go, and remembering the weight of commanding those floating cities, the responsibility he had carried, the trust placed in him to represent an entire civilization, the delicate balance required to project strength while offering friendship. Perhaps he understood something that escapes us in our hurried age, that the most profound changes happen slowly, almost invisibly, that the connections forged between peoples outlast the policies that created them, that the knowledge gained from pushing beyond familiar boundaries continues to shape decisions long after the original explorers have returned home. The treasure ships themselves may have been dismantled, but the charts they created remained. The diplomatic relationships they fostered continued to influence trade for generations. The proof that vast undertakings could succeed through patience and respect, rather than force. That insight became part of the Chinese understanding of what was possible. This is the deeper legacy of any transformative effort, isn't it? Not just the immediate results, the metrics you can measure, the revenue you can count, but the way it changes how people think about what's achievable, the way it expands the boundaries of the possible, creates new pathways for others to follow, proves that patient vision can indeed reshape the world. As you lie here now, in this quiet space between one day's challenges and tomorrow's responsibilities, you're part of that same continuum. The weight you carry, the vision you're nurturing, the connections you're building between what is and what could be. These efforts ripple outward in ways you may never fully see. The treasure fleets sailed into history, but their echo continues. In every leader who chooses collaboration over conquest, in every vision that prioritizes long-term value over short-term gain, in every moment when someone looks beyond familiar shores and asks, "What if we tried a different way?" Tonight, let that echo carry you toward rest, knowing that the patient work of building something meaningful, something that connects rather than divides, something that enriches rather than extracts, this work continues. The ships may return to harbor, but the voyage toward a better way of being in the world, that voyage has no final destination, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've chosen to sail toward it. One day, one decision, one connection at a time. The dream fades, but empires, like the leaders who guide them, are not eternal. And the winds that once filled those magnificent sails were already beginning to shift. In the Forbidden City, as autumn leaves drifted across courtyards where the Yongle Emperor once walked with such purpose, new voices were rising. Voices that questioned the wisdom of sending China's treasure across distant seas. When challenges pressed close to home, the new emperor, Yongle's son, inherited not just a throne, but the weight of choosing which dreams to carry forward, and which to quietly set aside. How familiar this must feel to you, lying here in the darkness, knowing that every vision you pursue means another left unexplored, Every resource committed to one path means another untaken. The Confucian scholars, who had watched those massive ships depart with quiet skepticism, now found their moment. In hushed palace corridors, they spoke of fiscal responsibility, of the enormous cost of maintaining fleets that brought back curiosities rather than conquest, of borders that needed defending closer to home. "Why send silver to distant kings," they whispered, "when that same silver could strengthen the realm within our borders?" It's the eternal tension, isn't it, between the audacious vision that sees possibility beyond the horizon and the practical wisdom that tends to what already exists. Both voices carry truth, and the weight you carry often comes from holding both simultaneously. Knowing that choosing one path means releasing another. The debates in the imperial court grew longer, more frequent. Ministers presented careful calculations, comparing the cost of 7 grand voyages against the pressing needs of the northern frontier, where nomadic tribes tested Chinese borders with increasing boldness. The treasure ships, those floating cities that had carried 30,000 souls across unknown waters, began to seem like expensive indulgences. The exotic gifts from foreign courts, the maps of distant coastlines, the knowledge of monsoon patterns and ocean currents, all of it suddenly appeared less valuable than the immediate security of the realm. And so, gradually, quietly, the vision faded. The shipyards at Longjiang, where master craftsmen had once worked with such purpose, where the sound of hammers on hull had rung out like a heartbeat of ambition, these yards grew silent. The specialized knowledge of building vessels capable of crossing oceans, this began to scatter like seeds on unready ground. The ships themselves, those magnificent vessels that had carried China's presence to the edges of the known world, were left to weather and time. Some were broken apart, their timber repurposed for more practical projects. Others simply aged, their hulls slowly surrendering to the patient work of decay. In the archives, the detailed logs of Zheng He's voyages, the careful records of winds and currents, the diplomatic correspondence with distant rulers, these gathered dust. The maps that had cost so much to create, that represented countless hours of careful observation and measurement, were filed away, consulted less and less frequently. Perhaps this touches something you recognize, the way ambitious projects can lose momentum, not through dramatic failure, but through the slow erosion of attention, the gradual shift of priorities, the quiet consensus that other things matter more. The foreign envoys, who had made the long journey to Beijing bearing gifts and hopes of continued partnership, found themselves received with diminishing enthusiasm. The regular arrival of Chinese fleets, which had become part of the rhythm of ports from Malacca to Calicut, simply stopped. Local rulers waited for ships that would never come. Merchants prepared goods for buyers who had turned their attention elsewhere. Harbor masters watched empty horizons, where magnificent sails had once appeared, with the reliability of seasons. And in China itself, the memory of those voyages began to fade from common knowledge. The stories that sailors had brought back, of cities built on water, of spices that could preserve meat through the longest winter, of peoples who had developed entirely different ways of understanding the stars. These stories were told less frequently, remembered by fewer voices. The next generation grew up knowing China as a land power, focused inward, concerned with borders that could be walked rather than sailed, with threats that arrived on horseback rather than by monsoon wind. It's a particular kind of melancholy, isn't it? The way transformative visions can simply fade, not destroyed by opposition, not defeated by catastrophe, but gradually overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of more immediate concerns, more practical priorities, more manageable dreams. The craftsmen who had known how to build ships capable of crossing oceans found their skills no longer needed. Some adapted, turning their knowledge toward river vessels, coastal traders, the smaller-scale projects that the new priorities demanded. Others simply retired, carrying their specialized understanding into silence. The naval traditions that had developed over 7 grand voyages, the hard-won knowledge of reading weather patterns thousands of miles from home, the diplomatic protocols for approaching foreign courts with gifts rather than weapons, all of this expertise, scattered, dispersed, gradually lost. And yet, something remained. In the ports of Southeast Asia, in the trading posts of India, in the memory of rulers who had received Chinese emissaries with mutual respect rather than submission, the echo of those voyages continued to resonate. The connections that had been forged, the precedent that had been set for a different kind of international relationship, the proof that massive undertakings could be accomplished through patience and planning rather than force. These things could not be entirely erased, even when official support disappeared. Perhaps this is what sustains you. In those moments when the weight you carry feels overwhelming, when the vision that drives you seems too large for the resources available, when voices around you question the wisdom of reaching beyond what's immediately practical, the knowledge that meaningful work, once accomplished, leaves traces that persist, even when the original vision is abandoned, even when official support fades, even when the next generation chooses a different path. The treasure fleets of Zheng He sailed for only 28 years, a brief moment in the long arc of history. But they proved something important about what becomes possible when audacious vision meets patient execution. When the desire to connect rather than conquer guides great undertakings, when leaders choose to build bridges across the unknown rather than walls against it. Tonight, as those magnificent ships fade into history, as their hulls return to the elements from which they came, as their sails dissolve into the same wind that once carried them toward distant horizons, let their echo remind you that the work you're doing, the connections you're building, the patient progress toward something better than what exists. This work has value beyond immediate recognition, beyond official support, beyond the shifting priorities of those who hold power in any particular moment. And as you drift toward the rest, you've earned. Let yourself feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing that meaningful work, once accomplished, becomes part of the permanent record of what humans can achieve when they choose hope over fear, connection over isolation, the long view over the immediate advantage, carrying you gently, inevitably, toward the deep peace that waits, just beyond the edge of consciousness.